Hello and welcome back to another Maya tutorial. This time we're looking at very basic render settings and how to add what we call a physical sun and sky to have a blue background and some basic shadows. To begin with, you need to make sure you have some kind of floor for your objects to sit on, otherwise they'll appear to be floating and you won't see any shadows at all. The next thing is to set up what we call a resolution gate, so we know exactly what's going to be in the render. Underneath your shelf you have View, and in there you have Camera Settings, and then you've got Resolution Gate. To turn the gate off, just select No Gate afterwards. So I'll go ahead and click on Resolution Gate, and now we can see exactly what will appear in the render. Now, too often I see people render things too far away and you can't really see what's going on. We need to actually zoom in a bit closer and position everything so our background or our floor is actually nice and straight. We don't want it really at an odd angle. So make sure it's straight, or if you want, it's something like that, so it's almost a diamond shape, but we don't really want to see any corners anywhere. It can be a bit distracting. So position this, and if you need to, resize the floor. So I'll expand the floor to make it wider. So we've got this continuous line in the background. The next thing to do is a very basic render. Now the render current frame button is at the top of the screen. Just hold the mouse over these different icons and you can see which one's which. So click on render current frame. And by default you'll get a really basic render. It's not even smoothed. Now we have different render engines, and the default is Maya software that won't render anything smooth, but it's very fast. We then have Maya hardware and a few others. Now hardware will render smoothed objects, but there's a much better one called Mental Ray. If you have Maya's version 2015 or older, Mental Ray is already installed for you when you install the software. However, if you've downloaded 2016, you need to download Mental Ray 2016 separately. It will still work with your current license, so if you've bought a version of Maya or if you have the student license, you can then get a free copy of Mental Ray. So download and install that, and whatever version you have, you need to activate the Mental Ray plugin. To do that, go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and in there, if we expand this and scroll right towards the bottom, it might look slightly different in 2015 or older, but you're looking for this one here, Maya's Mental Ray bundle. Go ahead and tick Loaded, and Auto Load means it should load up every time you reopen Maya. Click on Refresh and then Close, and that should now be in this drop down menu. So you've got Mental Ray. Try rendering that now. You can either go to your render current frame button at the top of the screen, or it's also in your render view here. It might take a few seconds to render. It really depends on the spec of your machine. So we can see now it's much smoother, but we don't have any shadows and the background is just plain black. So we need to look at adding a physical sun and sky. Now to do that, we need to access our render settings. There's different ways to do that. You can either, in your render view window, you can go to Options, Render Settings. You've also got your render settings at the top of the screen. If you hold the mouse over it again, it tells you what it is. Or, if you've closed everything, we can go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and then Render Settings. And in here, make sure it says Render using Mental Ray. In older versions, you'll need to look at my older tutorials to see how to do this because it changed in 2016. But in 2016, click on the Scene tab and then make sure you've got the environment options expanded, and then you've got physical sun and sky. Go ahead and click on Create. And by doing that, if I close down the render settings, you can see it's opened our attribute editor for us. Now we'll need this in a few minutes. But for now, we need to actually set the direction of the sun and sky. Now, to access that, if I go to Windows Outliner, you can see in addition to our objects, we have a sun direction. If I select that, By default, it goes in the center of the grid. Now I've got an object in the way, so I need to go to my move tool, and I can just move that up out the way. You might need to rotate round to really see those arrows, and we can just use the rotate tool and the move tool to actually reposition those. So I want my lighting coming from the top right, so I've got a shadow on the bottom left, and I've got it coming from in front of my object. We don't really want it coming from behind, otherwise the front of the object will be in darkness, it will be in a shadow. So I've got that roughly top right, shadow should be bottom left. It is a bit of trial and error, so you'll need to adjust this, try rendering it, and then see how it looks. So once we've done that, check the position of everything, make sure it's framed nicely, and then we can go ahead and click on the render current frame button again. It will take a few more seconds now because Maya's trying to calculate your lighting, your shadows, and there we have it. A much more realistic object, and we've got our shadow. Now, I find by default we get this horizon that's far too high. To lower that, all we need to do is select our sun direction arrows, and then if we have a look at our attribute editor, we have some different tabs at the top. Select the tab called Maya Physical Sky 1, and in there, towards the middle, you've got horizon height. The default value of 0 I find is too high. To lower it, we need a negative value, so perhaps -1 might be enough. Let's try that. And rather than rendering the whole frame, we can just select a region, and then rather than clicking render current frame, to the right of that we have render region. That means it will just render that particular area, so it's much faster. So we can see the horizon's dropped, not far enough. Let's try -1.75, let's see how that looks. Render the same region. Not quite, so let's try -2. It does depend entirely on how your camera's rotated. So let's render that region again. Much better. Now we can render the whole thing. Again, it takes a few seconds, it depends on the spec of your machine. Much better. Now you have to wait for it to actually say at the bottom that it's done. And we can see the resolution at default is 960 by 540. It also says in your perspective view at the top 960 by 540. Now we need to change that if you actually want to have a high definition render or if you want to print it. So to change the resolution, we need to access the render settings again. This time I'll go to options, render settings. Go to your common tab, and if we scroll down, you've got image size. Now if you understand resolution, this will be straightforward. If you don't, the general rule of thumb is the HD settings are fine for a screen. So if you go to HD 1080, it's fine for almost any monitor or a TV, but it's not going to be good enough to print. If you want to print, you need to have 300 dpi and you need to specify as the physical size. So if we scroll down, you actually have a default A4 and A3 set up for you. Now if I go to A4, it's in a portrait view, so you can see it's higher than it is wide. You might need to swap these numbers around. You'll need to reposition everything so it's framed nicely and it's the best possible frame you can have. And then click on render again. Now, if you are rendering in A4 or A3, it will take much longer, so save everything. Make sure you've tested it in a lower resolution first, and then increase your resolution. Once you've rendered it, you need to save the image. In your render view, you've got File, Save Image. If you click on that, give it a name, it should be going to your project folder by default, and you need to choose the file type. Now, a JPEG is the standard image format. If you want something a little bit better quality, you have a TIFF as well. Okay, so a quick tip, make sure it's all framed. Have a floor that's positioned so it's got a straight or a flat background. Render it in a low resolution first. Make sure you're happy, save it all, make a note of some of the settings you have, then increase your resolution and save it again.